Snow fell thick over the collapsed rooftops of the abandoned city, burying burned-out vehicles and bullet-riddled walls. Gunfire echoed through empty streets, ringing like metal on bone. When she stepped from the shadows wearing white snow camouflage and carrying an unfamiliar rifle, a Marine laughed over the radio. "Wrong gun, sweetheart." Nobody argued. Nobody looked at her twice. Then she stood upright in the blizzard. Wind screamed. Breath froze. A single shot tore through the battlefield and every laugh died silent. The city had no name anymore. Just coordinates on a tactical map, grid lines intersecting over what used to be residential blocks, shopping districts, parks where children played. Now it was skeletal architecture under 4 feet of snow. Building facades stood like broken teeth against a white sky. Metal frameworks twisted from collapsed apartments. Glass crunched underfoot, buried beneath ice that had been forming since the power grid died 3 weeks ago. Wind came in waves across the open streets, carrying snow horizontal. Visibility dropped to 30 meters, sometimes less. The kind of weather that turned infrared scopes into expensive paperweights and made every shadow a potential threat. Temperature sat at -18°C. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Radio signals broke apart in the storm. 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, had been holding the intersection of what used to be Merchant Street and 5th Avenue for 6 hours. 16 Marines scattered across 3 buildings, low on ammunition, communications failing. They'd taken the position at dawn, expecting relief by noon. It was now 1,600 hours. No relief, no resupply, just snow and the occasional crack of enemy fire from the high-rises to the north. Staff Sergeant Dale Brennan pressed against a wall of frozen concrete, watching snow accumulate on his rifle barrel. 38 years old, 2 deployments in desert heat, now fighting in conditions that made Afghanistan look like a vacation. His breath came in clouds that froze to his beard. The ACOG scope on his M4 had iced over twice already. Still, nothing from command, Corporal James Hutton said, hunched beside a shattered window. 24, from somewhere in Montana, the kind of kid who could navigate a blizzard better than most. Even he looked concerned. "They're probably snowed in like us," Brennan said. He didn't believe it. Command was 8 clicks south in a hardened position with working generators and hot food. They were ignoring 2nd Platoon because 2nd Platoon wasn't supposed to matter. Just a holding action while the main force repositioned. Except the enemy hadn't gotten that memo. Movement flickered in the whiteout shapes, crossing between buildings 400 meters north. Brennan raised his rifle, fingers sliding to the trigger guard. Too far for a clean shot in this weather. Too close for comfort. "Contact north," he said into his radio. Static answered. He tried again. More static, then a fragment of someone's voice, broken into syllables that meant nothing. "Radio's cooked," Hutton said. Brennan already knew. The cold was destroying batteries faster than they could swap them. The storm was scattering signals. They were deaf and blind in a city full of people who wanted them dead. 3 buildings over, Lance Corporal Maria Torres counted ammunition. 17 rounds left in her current magazine, 2 more magazines in her vest. 68 rounds total. She'd started the day with 210. Mathematics of survival. 16 Marines, average 40 rounds remaining, equals 640 rounds against an enemy force of unknown size, holding elevated positions with unlimited supplies. The numbers didn't work. "We need to pull back," Private First Class Kevin Marsh said. 19 years old, on his first deployment, already looking like he'd aged 5 years. "This position is garbage." "Position is fine," Torres said, though it wasn't. "We hold until we get new orders." "We're not getting new orders. Radio's dead." Torres didn't argue because he was right. She went back to counting bullets. Like counting would somehow make more appear. In the southern building, the one that used to be a pharmacy, someone sat alone on the 2nd floor, away from the main group. Not part of the radio chatter, or the ammunition counts, or the speculation about when relief would arrive. She wore the same white camouflage as the others, the same cold weather gear, the same exhaustion carved into her face. But her rifle was different, not the standard M4 or M27 carried by the rest of the platoon. Something longer, heavier, with a scope that looked handmade, wrapped in tape and cloth to prevent glare. Nobody had asked her about it. Nobody asked her about anything. She'd appeared 2 days ago with orders nobody could verify because communications were already failing. Attached to the platoon for additional marksmanship support, whatever that meant. No name on the roster, no identification visible on her gear. Just a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair pulled tight, gray eyes that tracked movement like a machine, and a rifle that didn't belong. She sat with her back against a wall riddled with bullet holes from some previous fight, methodically checking her equipment. Gloves off, fingers moving across the rifle with practiced precision. Bolt action smooth, trigger pull clean, magazine seated properly. She'd done this 1,000 times before in places nobody would ever hear about. Through the broken window, she could see the northern high-rises where the enemy had set up, 12 stories tall, windows blown out, perfect overwatch positions. Whoever held those buildings controlled the intersection. Controlled movement through this sector. Basic tactics. The enemy understood it. So did 2nd Platoon. The difference was the enemy had gotten there first. Wind gusted, shaking loose snow from overhead beams. It fell in sheets, adding to the drifts already piling against the walls. Outside, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped further. The city disappeared into white static. She pulled her gloves back on, slow and deliberate, flexed her fingers to maintain circulation. Cold was the enemy as much as the people in those high-rises. Cold made muscles stiff, made reactions slow, made the difference between hitting a target and missing by inches. Someone was shouting in the main building. Voices carrying across the gap between structures, audible even through the storm. She listened without moving, parsing meaning from tone and volume. They were arguing about what to do. Stay or retreat, fight or run. The same argument every surrounded unit had been having since warfare began. She knew what they'd decide before they did. They'd stay because Marines don't abandon positions without orders. They'd fight because that's what the training demanded. And they'd probably die because courage without options is just slow suicide. Unless something changed. She looked north again, counting windows in the high-rise, estimating distances, calculating wind drift and bullet drop at various ranges. The math was complex but familiar. Equations written in trajectories and terminal ballistics, solved in grain, weight, and muzzle velocity. 2,000 yards, give or take. In perfect conditions, a difficult shot. In a blizzard, impossible. She'd made impossible shots before, but nobody here knew that. Nobody here knew anything about her except that she'd shown up with the wrong rifle and kept to herself. They probably thought she was some rear echelon specialist who'd gotten lost in the rotation, ended up at the front by accident. Let them think it. Assumptions kept things simple. Another gust of wind. More snow. The temperature dropped another degree. Night would come early under these clouds, and fighting in the dark would be worse than fighting in the storm. Time was running out for 2nd Platoon. She stood, slinging the rifle across her back, and moved toward the stairwell. Boots crunching on ice and broken glass. Nobody watched her go. Nobody noticed. She'd learned a long time ago that being underestimated was the most useful weapon in any arsenal. The main building smelled like mold and cordite. Snow had drifted through broken windows, creating white dunes across the floor. Brass casings scattered everywhere from previous firefights. The walls were tagged with graffiti in 3 languages, messages from civilians who'd abandoned this place long before it became a battlefield. Staff Sergeant Brennan stood over a tactical map spread across an overturned desk, arguing with Sergeant First Class Rachel Kimball about their next move. Kimball wanted to fortify and wait. Brennan wanted to probe the enemy positions, test their strength. Neither option was good. "We don't have the ammunition for a probe," Kimball said. She was 42, career military, had seen enough combat to know when a position was untenable, and we don't have the supplies to wait them out. "So, what do you suggest?" "I suggest we stop pretending we're in command and start figuring out how to survive until someone remembers we exist." Before Brennan could respond, the woman with the unfamiliar rifle entered the room. She moved quietly, staying near the walls, not interrupting. Just present. Corporal Hutton noticed her first. "Hey, you're the new sniper, right?" She nodded once. "What's your name?" "Doesn't matter," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, with an accent that placed her nowhere specific. Could have been from anywhere, or nowhere at all. Hutton exchanged glances with another Marine. "Okay, mysterious. What unit are you from?" "Doesn't matter either." Right. Hutton looked her over, taking in the non-standard gear. The rifle that looked homemade, the complete absence of rank or identification. You know the enemy's got our range, right? They're sitting up in those buildings just waiting for us to make a move. I know. So what's your plan, sniper? You going to take them out from here? She didn't answer, just moved to the window and looked north through the snow, studying the high-rises with the same mechanical precision she'd applied to her rifle maintenance. Staff Sergeant Brennan finally acknowledged her presence. You have something to contribute, specialist? She turned from the window. What's the distance to the northern buildings? 1,800 to 2,200 yards, depending on which floor they're on. Wind? Gusting 15 to 25 knots from the northwest. Variable. Temperature? -18 Celsius, dropping. She processed this information without expression, running calculations that showed nowhere on her face. Then she looked at Brennan directly. I need to set up a shooting position. Sergeant Kimball laughed. Not cruel, just disbelieving. In this weather? At that range? You're not making any shots through a blizzard. I've made harder shots. Sure, you have. Kimball wasn't being dismissive, just realistic. Look, I appreciate the confidence, but physics doesn't care about your experience. Wind like this will push around 6 feet off target at 2,000 yards. Snow will disrupt your sight picture. Cold will affect your powder burn. You'd be guessing. I don't guess. Private First Class Marsh stepped forward, arms crossed. He'd been listening from the corner, growing more irritated with each exchange. Hey, mystery woman, you know what rifle that is you're carrying? She didn't respond. That's not a military-issue weapon, Marsh continued. That's not even a standard sniper platform. What is it? Some custom build you put together in your garage? It's what I use. Well, you're using the wrong tool for the job, sweetheart. He said it casually, the way someone might point out a mistake in judgment. You want to make long-range shots in combat. You use a platform that's been tested. M110, M2010, something with documentation and support. Not whatever Franken rifle you're humping around. Several Marines chuckled. Not malicious laughter, just the kind of humor that comes from stress and exhaustion. Everyone was looking for something to lighten the tension, and the weird sniper with her weird rifle was an easy target. She absorbed the comment without reaction. No anger, no embarrassment, no defensive posturing, just that same mechanical calm, like Marsh had commented on the weather instead of insulting her competence. You done? She asked. Just saying, if you're going to pretend to be a sniper, at least carry a sniper rifle. She nodded slowly, like he'd made a valid point worth considering. Then she turned back to Brennan. I need a clear line of sight to the high rises. Upper floor, north-facing window. Brennan studied her, trying to assess if this was confidence or delusion. Every instinct said nobody could make an effective shot at that range in these conditions. But every instinct also said they were running out of options, and desperate situations required desperate measures. You really think you can hit something at 2,000 yards in a blizzard? He asked. I know I can. That's not the same as proving you can. Let me prove it then. Sergeant Kimball stepped between them. Sir, we don't have ammunition to waste on impossible shots. Every round counts right now. I'm not asking to waste anything, the woman said. I'm asking for one shot. If I miss, you lose one bullet. If I hit, you lose one enemy position. The room went quiet. Outside, wind hammered against the building, rattling loose panels and howling through gaps in the walls. Snow continued to fall, burying everything in white. Corporal Hutton broke the silence. What makes you think you won't miss? She looked at him with those gray machine eyes. Because I've never missed when it mattered. Bold claim. Verifiable result. Brennan made a decision. Fine. 3rd floor, northeast corner. Set up whatever position you need. You get one shot. Make it count. She moved toward the stairs without acknowledging the order, already planning the setup in her head. Behind her, the Marines exchanged skeptical looks, placing mental bets on how badly this was going to fail. Wrong gun, wrong plan, wrong weather, Marsh muttered to Hutton. This is going to be a disaster. Give her credit for trying, Hutton said. Trying gets you killed in combat. Results keep you alive. The woman paused at the stairwell entrance, though she gave no indication she'd heard them. Her hand rested briefly on the rifle, slung across her back, the wrong rifle, according to everyone in this room. The rifle that didn't belong, carried by a person who didn't belong, preparing to attempt something that couldn't be done. She'd heard variations of this doubt her entire career. Different voices, same skepticism. Men who assumed equipment mattered more than skill. Men who measured competence by conformity to standards they'd memorized from manuals. None of them understood that the rifle wasn't wrong. It was precisely calibrated for conditions like these, built for scenarios that standard military platforms couldn't handle, customized through years of field experience that would never appear in any official report. But explaining that would require revealing information she couldn't share. So she let them think whatever made them comfortable. Let them believe she was overconfident or delusional or just desperate for validation. Their belief was irrelevant. The math was what mattered. The wind, the distance, the target. Everything else was noise. She climbed the stairs into darkness, leaving the voices behind. The northern high-rises dominated the skyline like broken monuments. 12 stories of reinforced concrete and steel, windows blown out from previous battles, walls scarred with impact craters. The buildings had been luxury apartments once, before the war. Now they were tactical assets worth more than gold. Whoever controlled those towers controlled the entire district. Perfect overwatch into every street, every intersection, every approach. The enemy had seized them 4 days ago and converted the upper floors into fortified firing positions. Sandbags stacked in windows, heavy weapons mounted on tripods, observers with binoculars and radios coordinating fields of fire. From their elevated vantage point, they could see everything 2nd Platoon did. Every movement between buildings, every attempt to reposition, every exposed Marine became a target the moment they broke cover. It was a killing field with no good exits. Staff Sergeant Brennan understood this in his bones. He'd been in enough urban fights to recognize the geometry of death. The enemy held the high ground. 2nd Platoon held nothing except slowly diminishing hope. He watched through his rifle scope as shadows moved in the northern windows, counting positions, estimating numbers. At least 15 hostiles, probably more, armed with rifles and crew-served weapons that could tear through the platoon's cover like wet paper. "They're just waiting for us to make a mistake," Sergeant Kimball said, crouched beside him. "They don't even need to attack. Just sit up there and pick us off whenever we move." "We can't stay here forever," Brennan said. "We can't fight our way out either. Not with what we have left." 300 meters east, Lance Corporal Torres tried to flank around a collapsed storefront and got driven back by accurate fire from the 11th floor. Rounds impacted close enough to spray her with concrete fragments. She scrambled to cover, breathing hard, recognizing how close she'd come to dying. "They've got every angle covered," she reported over the dying radio. "Can't move without getting spotted." Corporal Hutton had tried something similar 20 minutes earlier, probing west toward what used to be a subway entrance. Same result, immediate suppressing fire from multiple positions. He'd retreated with a round through his sleeve and a new appreciation for how thoroughly the enemy controlled this intersection. "We're pinned," Hutton said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be stated. "We need air support or artillery or something we don't have." "Air support can't fly in this weather," Kimball reminded him, "and artillery won't risk hitting us with proximity this close." "So what do we do?" Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. In the center of the intersection, Private First Class Marsh lay behind a destroyed vehicle, trying to provide cover fire for anyone attempting to move. He'd been in this position for 2 hours, slowly freezing, watching his ammunition dwindle with each burst. The vehicle was a burned-out sedan, doors blown off, hood riddled with holes. Not real cover, just the illusion of protection. He squeezed off 3 rounds at a window on the 10th floor where he'd seen movement. The rounds vanished into the storm, no way to tell if they'd hit anything or just disappeared into the snow. He didn't fire again. Couldn't afford to waste more bullets on maybes. "Marsh, pull back," Brennan ordered through the radio static. "You're too exposed." "Can't pull back, Sergeant. If I move, they'll light up everyone in the southern buildings. If you stay, they'll kill you." "Then I guess I'm staying." That was the math of their situation. Every Marine holding a position they couldn't defend, covering sectors they couldn't cover, buying time they didn't have. A stalemate that could only end one way. Sergeant Kimball pulled out her tactical map, though she'd memorized every detail hours ago. The map was just something to focus on besides the reality of their situation. If we had a team in those northern buildings, we could suppress their observers long enough to evacuate. We don't have a team, Brennan said. We don't even have a functioning radio to call for one. I know, I'm just saying hypothetically. Hypothetically, we're screwed. Kimball couldn't argue. She folded the map and returned it to her vest, a gesture of resignation that everyone recognized. From his position behind the burned sedan, Marsh watched the high-rises through his rifle scope. The snow was so thick now, he could barely make out individual windows. Just vague shapes and shadows, any one of which might be an enemy fighter lining up a shot. He thought about his family in Ohio, his mother who didn't want him to enlist, his father who'd served in the Navy and understood, his little sister who thought war was like the movies, heroic and clean and noble. He wished he could tell her the truth. That war was freezing in the snow behind a destroyed car, watching your ammunition run out while people you'd never met tried to kill you for reasons you'd stopped understanding months ago. A round cracked past his head, close enough to feel the displacement. He ducked instinctively, heart hammering. When he looked up again, the enemy position seemed closer, more numerous, more inevitable. "We're not going to make it out of this," he said to nobody in particular. Lance Corporal Torres heard him through her radio earpiece. She wanted to disagree, to say something encouraging about never giving up or reinforcements arriving. But she was a poor liar, and this wasn't the time for false hope. "Probably not," she admitted. "But we're going to make them pay for it." That was all they had left. Not victory, not escape. Just the promise that when the end came, they'd go down fighting. Small comfort in a frozen city, but sometimes small comfort was all you got. In the third-floor room of the southern building, the woman with the wrong rifle finished setting up her shooting position. She'd cleared snow from the window, arranged a makeshift rest using debris and cloth, calculated sight angles and wind compensation. The rifle lay across the improvised platform, barrel angled toward the northern high-rises. She could see what the others couldn't. See past the immediate tactical problem to the structural weakness beneath. The enemy controlled the high ground, yes. But control required coordination. Coordination required command. Command concentrated in specific locations. Take out command, create chaos. Create chaos, break coordination. Break coordination, eliminate the advantage. Simple theory, complex execution. She pulled out a small notebook, weatherproof pages covered in handwritten calculations and range cards, years of field data, collected from engagements nobody would ever read about. She flipped to the section on extreme range shooting in adverse weather, found the formulas she needed, began working through the math. Distance, approximately 2,100 yards to the target window she'd identified. Wind, gusting northwest at 20 knots, variable. Temperature, -18 Celsius, affecting powder burn and air density. Barometric pressure, low from the storm system. Coriolis effect, negligible at this range and latitude, but present. She wrote numbers in the margins, scratching out corrections and adjustments. The math was brutal. Every variable compounded the difficulty. In perfect conditions, this would be a challenging shot. In a blizzard, it was absurd. But absurd didn't mean impossible, just improbable, and improbable outcomes were her specialty. She looked through the scope, finding the target window on the 11th floor, where she'd observed the most consistent activity, command post, most likely, where decisions got made and orders got transmitted. The nervous system of the enemy operation. Sever the nervous system, paralyze the body. Her finger brushed the trigger guard, feeling the cold metal through her glove. Not yet. Still more calculations to run, more variables to account for. Shooting was the easy part. Everything before the shot was what separated professionals from amateurs. Below, in the main building, the Marines continued their debate about retreat or last stands, arguing over scenarios that didn't matter because none of them had the information to make the decision that would actually save them. They didn't know what she knew, didn't see what she saw, didn't understand that salvation wasn't going to come from above or behind. It was going to come from 2,100 yards away, traveling at 2,700 feet per second, delivered by someone they'd already dismissed. She checked her watch. 1,000. 647 hours. Daylight fading. Window of opportunity closing. Time to show them what the wrong rifle could do. There were Marines in this platoon who'd been fighting for months and still appeared in every official roster. Men and women whose names existed in databases, whose service records tracked promotions and deployments, whose families received regular letters confirming their loved ones' continued existence. She was not one of them. No name on the platoon manifest, no service number in the computer systems, no official orders assigning her to Bravo Company or any other unit. She'd simply appeared 2 days ago during a supply run, wearing the right gear and carrying authorization codes that checked out when anyone bothered to verify them. Most hadn't bothered. In the chaos of combat operations, an extra rifle was an extra rifle. Questions could wait for peacetime, but there were no records because there were never records. She existed in the gaps between official documentation, operating in a space the military pretended didn't exist. No rank because rank created chains of command. No identification because identification created targets. No past because the past was full of operations that would remain classified until everyone involved was dead. She'd been doing this for 11 years. Different conflicts, different continents, always the same role. The person who made impossible shots when conventional approaches failed. The ghost who appeared when plans collapsed and disappeared before anyone could debrief her properly. Her real name didn't matter because she'd stopped using it after the first deployment. Her background didn't matter because it had been sanitized and redacted and buried under classification levels that required presidential authorization to access. All that mattered was her capability, refined through repetition in circumstances most soldiers never encountered. She'd washed out of sniper school at 22. Not because she couldn't shoot. The instructors admitted she had better fundamentals than anyone in the class. She'd washed out because she couldn't conform to the doctrine. Couldn't accept that certain shots were impossible because the manual said they were impossible. Couldn't believe that equipment limitations should dictate operational outcomes. So they'd failed her for insubordination and creative interpretation of engagement protocols. Sent her back to regular infantry with a note in her file about failure to adapt to military structure. 3 months later, someone from an agency with no public name had pulled that file, recognized that what the Marine Corps called insubordination, they called innovation, offered her a different path. She'd taken it. The training that followed had nothing to do with military doctrine. It was practical application of physics and mathematics in lethal context, learning to build custom rifles from available components, understanding ballistics at a level that made standard range tables obsolete, developing the mental discipline to make shots that existed in the narrow gap between difficult and impossible. They'd sent her to places that didn't appear in news reports, made her take shots that would never be acknowledged. She'd killed people whose deaths created cascading effects in conflicts the public would never know existed. Each time, she'd succeeded. Each time, she'd disappeared before questions could be asked. 11 years of that. 11 years of being the person who solved problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. Now she was here, in a frozen city with a platoon that didn't know who she was, preparing to do what she'd always done, make the impossible look inevitable. She opened her pack and pulled out a small leather case. Inside were 5 rounds of ammunition, not military issue, custom loads she'd prepared herself, adjusted for the specific characteristics of her rifle and the environmental conditions she anticipated. Each round represented hours of precise work, measuring powder charges to the 10th of a grain, seating bullets to exact depths, checking overall cartridge length with calipers accurate to thousandths of an inch. These weren't factory rounds churned out by the millions. These were individually crafted solutions to ballistic problems. She loaded one into the rifle's chamber, feeling the smooth action of the bolt, the metallic click of engagement, the slight resistance as the extractor gripped the rim. 5 rounds. She'd need 1. The others were backups for scenarios where the first shot didn't create the desired effect. But in 11 years, she'd never needed a backup. First-round impacts weren't luck. They were the expected outcome when you controlled all the variables that could be controlled. Through the scope, she could see movement in the target window, silhouettes shifting, backlit by interior lighting someone had foolishly left on. Command post confirmed, probably officers or experienced fighters coordinating the siege. People whose deaths would matter tactically. She made fine adjustments to the scope's elevation dial, clicking through minutes of angle, compensating for distance and gravity. Each click representing a tiny change that would translate to feet of difference at 2,000 yards. Wind was the hardest variable. Not just speed, but direction, and not just at her position, but across the entire flight path of the bullet. Wind at the muzzle pushing the round one way, wind at mid-range pushing it another, wind at the target potentially canceling or compounding previous drift. She couldn't measure wind at 2,000 yards, could only observe indicators, snow patterns, debris movement, the way the storm front was tracking across the sky. From those observations, build a model of what the wind was probably doing in the space her bullet would travel through. Probably, not certainly. This was where art intersected science, where experience and intuition filled gaps that instruments couldn't measure. She'd made these kinds of shots before, in mountains where wind sheared unpredictably across ridgelines, in deserts where heat created vertical currents that bent trajectories, in jungles where humidity changed air density minute by minute. Always the same process. Observe, calculate, adjust, trust. The last part was hardest. Trusting that your preparation was sufficient, that your calculations were correct, that when you pressed the trigger, the mathematics you'd relied on would prove true in physical space. She took a slow breath, watching condensation form in the air before her face. Heart rate steady at 60 beats per minute. Blood pressure normal, no tremor in her hands. The cold should have affected her more, but she'd trained her body to maintain precision even when physiology argued against it. This was what she'd been built for, not the person she'd been 22 years ago with dreams of conventional military service. The person she'd become through failure and reconstruction. Someone who existed in margins and operated in gaps, and solved problems by refusing to accept that problems were unsolvable. Below, the Marines continued their futile planning, mapping retreat routes that didn't exist, calculating ammunition distribution for a fight they couldn't win. Good people doing their best with inadequate resources against overwhelming disadvantage. She could save them. Would save them. Not because they'd asked or because she'd been ordered, but because saving them aligned with the mission parameters she'd been given before communications collapsed. Stabilize. 2nd Platoon's position. Eliminate command and control in the northern sector. Create opportunity for tactical repositioning. Simple objectives. Complex execution. She checked her watch again. 651 hours. Light fading faster now. Soon, the storm and darkness would merge into complete obscurity. The window for this shot was closing. Time to work. She settled into her shooting position, body aligned behind the rifle, weight distributed to minimize movement, left hand supporting the forestock, right hand on the grip, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. Breathing slowed, 2 seconds in, 2 seconds out, metronomic precision. The target window filled her scope view. She could see details now. Equipment stacked against interior walls, maps spread on tables, people moving with purpose. One person standing closest to the window, gesturing, giving orders. That one. Wind gusted. Snow swirled. The building seemed to shift in the thermal distortion of her scope. She waited. Patience was ammunition you never ran out of. Staff Sergeant Brennan was halfway through explaining why a night withdrawal was suicide when she walked back into the room. The same mechanical calm, the same unreadable expression. She didn't interrupt, just stood near the doorway waiting for an appropriate moment to speak. Sergeant Kimball noticed her first. You get your position set up? And you still think you can make this shot? I know I can. Brennan turned from the map, frustration evident in his posture. Look, I appreciate the confidence, but we need realistic assessments right now. Can you actually hit a target at 2,000 yards and zero visibility, or are you just... I need to shoot standing, she said. The room went silent. Corporal Hutton broke first. Standing? As in, not prone? Not using cover? Correct. That's... He struggled for words. That's insane. It's necessary. Lance Corporal Torres stepped forward. Okay, I'll bite. Why is it necessary to expose yourself like that? The woman moved to the window and pointed north through the snow. The building I'm in has inconsistent floor integrity. prone position puts my weight across compromised sections. The collapse risk is unacceptable. So, shoot from a different building, Marsh said. Different buildings don't have the angle I need. The target window is recessed from this perspective. I need elevation to clear the wall. Sergeant Kimball studied her, trying to determine if this was tactical reasoning or rationalization for something reckless. You're telling me the only way to make this shot is to stand fully exposed in a window while enemy observers have line of sight to your position? They'll see you the second you break concealment. Probably. They'll shoot back. Almost certainly. And you think you'll have time to make an aimed shot before they kill you? The woman met Kimball's eyes without flinching. I don't think, I calculate, the mathematics support the approach. Brennan shook his head. What mathematics support standing in the open while getting shot at? She pulled out her weatherproof notebook, flipped to a page covered in diagrams and equations. The enemy's current engagement pattern shows a 3 to 4 second reaction time from visual acquisition to effective fire. That's identification, target designation, weapon orientation, and trigger press. 4 seconds, Hutton said. That's not a lot of time. It's sufficient. My shot preparation is complete. I need 2 seconds to stand, acquire, target through the scope, and fire. That leaves a 1 to 2 second margin. That's a 1 to 2 second margin for error where error means you die, Torres pointed out. Acceptable risk. Private Marsh laughed, though there was no humor in it. Acceptable? Lady, you're talking about playing chicken with trained soldiers who have automatic weapons. That's not risk management. That's suicide with extra steps. She didn't respond to that, just continued explaining her methodology. The standing position also offers better recoil management at this range. Prone shooting against a hard surface creates bounce that affects follow-up shot placement. Standing allows natural body mechanics to absorb recoil. You're planning a follow-up shot? Kimball asked. You just said you'd have 4 seconds before they start shooting. I won't need a follow-up shot. But if the situation demands one, I want the option. Brennan rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. This is the most elaborate suicide proposal I've ever heard. It's not suicide. It's calculated tactics based on enemy behavior patterns and environmental constraints. You can't possibly have enough data to make those calculations accurate. The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of something that might have been annoyance, quickly suppressed. I've been observing enemy patterns for 43 hours, documented 17 separate engagements, tracked response times, weapon selection, coordination protocols. The data is sufficient. She flipped through her notebook, showing pages of meticulous observations, times, positions, behaviors, everything recorded in tiny, precise handwriting that spoke to obsessive attention to detail. Sergeant Kimball took the notebook, scanning the entries. Each one was dated, timed to the minute, cross-referenced with tactical observations. Weather conditions noted, wind speeds estimated. The kind of intelligence compilation that took serious field discipline. You did all this in the last 2 days? Kimball asked. Intelligence gathering is continuous. I don't stop observing because I'm not actively shooting. Kimball handed the notebook back, reassessing the woman standing before her. Maybe not delusional. Maybe something else entirely. All right, let's say your calculations are perfect. Let's say you have exactly 4 seconds. What happens after you take the shot? I move to secondary position, while they're shooting at you, while they're reacting to the primary target going down. Brennan leaned against the wall, thinking through the implications. You really believe killing one person in that building will change our tactical situation? Not one person. One specific person. Command and control node. I've identified the individual coordinating their observation and fire distribution. How can you possibly know that? Behavioral analysis. Watch who others look to before making decisions. Who holds the radio? Who stands in positions of authority rather than cover? It's not difficult if you know what to look for. Torres whistled softly. You're talking about decapitation strike, kill the leader, break the chain of command. Exactly. Hutton crossed his arms. And if you're wrong, if you've identified the wrong person, then I've killed someone in a leadership position, which still degrades their coordination capacity. The effect is smaller, but present. And if you miss entirely, I won't miss. Everyone misses sometimes. not at ranges that matter. The confidence should have been arrogant, but it wasn't delivered with arrogance. Just flat statement of capability, the way someone might state they knew how to read or drive. A skill so internalized, it became fact rather than boast. Private Marsh wasn't buying it. Look, I don't care how good you think you are. Nobody makes a 2,000-yard shot in a blizzard while standing exposed to enemy fire. It's physically impossible. Improbable? She corrected. Not impossible. There's a difference. Semantics won't stop bullets. No. Proper execution will. Brennan made a decision. The situation was deteriorating regardless. Staying meant slow attrition. Retreating meant fighting through a kill zone. At least this option, however insane, offered the possibility of changing the tactical picture. Fine, he said. You get your shot. But if you're going to do this, we need to support it. Torres, Hutton, set up covering fire positions. The second she breaks concealment, I want suppressing fire on every visible window in that building. That'll burn through half our remaining ammunition, Kimball objected. And if this works, we won't need the ammunition. If it doesn't work, we weren't going to survive anyway. Kimball didn't argue further. The logic was sound, even if the plan was insane. Torres and Hutton moved to gather the other Marines, explaining the plan in quick, efficient terms. Reactions ranged from disbelief to grim acceptance. Nobody thought this was a good idea, but nobody had a better one either. The woman checked her watch. And 1,656 hours. I'll take the shot at 1,700. That gives you 4 minutes to get into position. Why 1,700? Brennan asked. Light is optimal for the next 6 minutes. After that, visibility degrades too much. If I'm going to do this, it needs to be now. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. After I fire, regardless of outcome, no one comes to my position. If I'm hit, I handle it myself. If I'm successful, I relocate independently. Clear? Why? Torres asked. Because if this fails, there's no reason to risk additional casualties trying to extract me. And if it succeeds, I'll be mobile enough to move on my own. Before anyone could argue, she was gone, moving back toward the stairwell with that same quiet efficiency, leaving behind a room full of Marines who weren't sure if they'd just witnessed tactical brilliance or elaborate suicide. She's going to die, Marsh said quietly. Maybe, Brennan replied, but at least she's dying on her terms. Sergeant Kimball checked her rifle, preparing for the covering fire Brennan had ordered. You know what bothers me most? She never asked permission, never requested backup, just stated what she was going to do and expected us to adapt. Some people don't ask permission, Brennan said. They just act and let the world catch up. That usually gets people killed. Usually. But sometimes it gets them remembered. Outside, the storm continued to build. Snow fell in sheets. Wind screamed between buildings. Temperature dropped another degree toward frostbite and hypothermia. In 4 minutes, someone was going to stand in a window and attempt something that shouldn't be possible. The Marines of 2nd Platoon took their positions, checking weapons and ammunition counts, preparing to provide covering fire for a shot they didn't believe could be made by a person they didn't understand. But they'd do it anyway, because that's what Marines did. Support each other even when the plan was insane. Especially when the plan was insane. The clock counted down toward 1,700 hours. Toward the moment when impossible would become real or become death. Nothing in between. At 1,659 hours and 40 seconds, she stood. Movement was economical. No wasted motion. Right foot planted first, left foot following. Weight distribution balanced between both. The rifle came up in a single smooth arc, buttstock settling against her shoulder pocket. Left hand found the forestock support position. Right hand on the grip, finger outside the trigger guard. 2 seconds. Just like she'd calculated. Through the scope, the northern high-rise snapped into focus. 11th floor, 3rd window from the left. Interior details visible despite the snow because she'd accounted for atmospheric distortion in her scope adjustments. The target was there, standing exactly where she'd predicted. Male, approximately 45 years old, wearing a tactical vest with radio equipment. He was pointing at something outside the window, giving instructions to someone out of frame. Command confirmed. Her finger moved to the trigger. Not pressing yet. Just making contact, feeling the curve of metal through her glove. The rifle weighed 9 pounds empty, 11 pounds loaded. She'd fired it exactly 1,847 times. Knew its character like she knew her own breathing. The target turned slightly, adjusting his position. Better angle now, center mass exposed. Wind gusted from the northwest. She watched snow particles streak past her window, read their velocity and trajectory, 22 knots, consistent with her earlier estimates. Breathing slowed. In for 2 seconds. Out for 2 seconds. Heart rate holding at 60 beats per minute, despite the adrenaline and the knowledge that in approximately 3 more seconds, people would start shooting at her. The scope's reticle centered on the target's chest. She made a final microscopic adjustment, shifting aim 3 inches left to account for wind drift across 2,100 yards of storm. Time compressed. The world narrowed to that single window, that single person, that single mathematical problem requiring a physical solution. First, pressure on the trigger, taking up the slack, feeling the resistance build. Somewhere in her peripheral vision, movement, enemy observers spotting her silhouette, weapons turning. The 4-second clock had started. She had 2 seconds left. Second pressure. The trigger broke clean. No creep, no surprise. Just the controlled release of mechanical energy translated into chemical expansion. The rifle fired. Sound and force simultaneous. The stock punched her shoulder. Muzzle flash illuminated falling snow. The report echoed across the frozen cityscape, a crack of thunder in white silence. The rifle's recoil carried her back half a step. She rode it, maintaining sight picture, watching through the scope as the world moved in slow frames. The bullet left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second, spinning at 1-inch, 10-inch twist rate, traveling through air that was -18 Celsius, 32% humidity, wind gusting at 22 knots from the northwest. Physics took over. The bullet followed a parabolic arc, fighting gravity and drag. Every microsecond, it slowed infinitesimally. Every inch of travel, it drifted according to wind pressure against its surface. At 500 yards, the bullet had climbed to peak trajectory, beginning its descent. At 1,000 yards, crosswind had pushed it 14 inches right. She'd calculated 16 inches of correction, 2 inches of error margin. At 1,500 yards, the bullet was dropping fast, gravity pulling harder as velocity decreased. At 2,000 yards, vertical drop exceeded 80 feet from line of sight. The bullet was falling like a stone, still traveling fast enough to kill but slow enough that another 100 yards might have made the shot impossible. Through the scope, she watched. The target was still pointing, still giving orders, still unaware that death was traveling toward him at supersonic speed. Then his chest erupted. No warning, no sound of impact to hear before it happened, just the sudden violent reality of a 175-grain bullet punching through sternum and spine and exiting through his back in a spray of red mist. He dropped. Instant. Neural connection severed, muscle control gone. He was dead before his brain could process the damage. Behind him, the wall painted itself red. Time returned to normal speed. Through her scope, she watched chaos unfold. People in the command post reacting to the body, shouting, confusion, the sudden violent disruption of their operational rhythm. She'd counted 2 seconds to fire, used 1.8, margin maintained. Now came the hard part. Incoming fire erupted from the northern buildings, muzzle flashes from at least 6 positions. Rounds impacted the window frame around her. Concrete exploded in dust and fragments. Glass shattered. The wall beside her head disintegrated under sustained automatic fire. But she was already moving. 3 steps back, drop to the floor, roll left behind a support column. The whole sequence took 1.2 seconds. Bullets tracked where she'd been, not where she was. Below, the Marines opened up with suppressing fire. Every rifle and second platoon pouring rounds toward the northern high-rise. Not aimed fire, they couldn't see targets clearly enough for precision. Just volume. Dozens of rounds hammering into windows, forcing enemy shooters to take cover. The volume of fire was incredible, deafening even through building walls and storm noise. A sustained roar of overlapping reports as magazines dumped into the blizzard. She crawled to the secondary position she'd prepared. Different window, different angle. The rifle came up again, barrel resting on a stable surface. Through the scope, she could see the effect of her shot. The command post was in disarray. No one coordinating. No one giving orders. Just fighters reacting independently, firing at the approximate position where her muzzle flash had appeared. In 30 seconds, their response fire had already diminished. Without coordination, without command telling them to maintain suppression, individual fighters were making individual decisions about ammunition expenditure. The decapitation strike had worked exactly as intended. She watched as they tried to reorganize, watched someone else attempt to take command, shouting and gesturing, but the rhythm was broken, the certainty gone. They'd been sieging a trapped platoon with overwhelming advantage. Now their commander was dead from a shot that shouldn't have been possible, and nobody knew what to do next. Fear was entering their calculations. The possibility that there were other impossible shots waiting in the storm. She could take one of them right now. The person trying to assume command, reset the chaos, extend the confusion. But that wasn't the mission. The mission was to break their coordination long enough for second platoon to reposition. One shot had accomplished that. A second shot would just waste ammunition and reveal her new position. She lowered the rifle and began breaking down her shooting setup. Methodical, professional, the same way she'd set it up, now reversed. 45 seconds to pack everything, 60 seconds to clear the floor and move to another building entirely. By the time anyone organized a response to her secondary position, she'd be 3 buildings away. Behind her, the window where she'd taken the shot was still being pulverized by incoming fire. Hundreds of rounds turning that space into a debris cloud. If she'd stayed there, she'd be dead now. But she hadn't stayed, because she'd calculated exactly how long she had before effective return fire arrived, and her calculations, as always, had been correct. She moved through the building's interior, navigating by memory and tactical awareness. No light, no sound except the storm and distant gunfire. Just smooth, efficient movement through darkness. At the ground floor, she paused near a window overlooking the main intersection. Through the snow, she could see Marines beginning to move, taking advantage of the confusion, repositioning to better defensive positions while the enemy was still dealing with their command loss. Staff Sergeant Brennan's voice crackled over someone's radio. All units, displaced to secondary positions. Move now while they're disorganized. The platoon flowed like water through the gaps in enemy observation, smooth, coordinated, using the window she'd created. She watched them go, satisfied with the outcome. Mission parameters met. Tactical situation stabilized, Marines surviving who would have died otherwise. Her work was done. She turned away from the window and moved deeper into the city's ruins, leaving no trace except the memory of an impossible shot and a body cooling in a room 2,100 yards away. The enemy fighters on the 11th floor couldn't process what had just happened. Their commander, the man who'd been coordinating their siege for 3 days, was dead, not wounded, not incapacitated, completely, definitively dead, with a hole through his chest the size of a fist and his blood painting the wall behind him in arterial spray patterns. And nobody knew where the shot had come from. Yuri Volkov, second in command by default rather than designation, stared at the body while automatic weapons fire poured into what they assumed was the shooter's position. 3 buildings south, upper floor, northeast corner. They were destroying that window with concentrated fire from 6 positions. But something felt wrong. "Cease fire," Volkov shouted in Russian. "Stop wasting ammunition." The firing gradually stopped. Silence returned, broken only by wind and the occasional crack of a Marine rifle from the intersection below. Volkov moved carefully to the window where Commander Petrov had been standing. The snow outside was undisturbed except by wind. The buildings across the intersection showed no movement, no muzzle flashes, no indication of where the fatal shot had originated. "Where did it come from?" asked Dmitri, young and shaken, cradling his rifle like a talisman. "South," Volkov said, though he wasn't certain. The angle of impact suggested south, but the distance, that couldn't be right. He looked at Petrov's body again. Entry wound front, exit wound back. The bullet had been traveling north to south. Simple trajectory analysis. but the exit wound size suggested the bullet had still been carrying significant energy at impact, which meant long range, very long range. "Check the ammunition," Volkov ordered. "See if you can find the bullet." Two fighters searched the wall behind where Petrov had fallen. After 30 seconds, one called out, "Here," embedded in the concrete. Volkov examined the deformed copper and lead, heavy grain weight, high-quality construction, not standard military issue, custom ammunition. His stomach tightened. "Distance estimate?" he asked the group's designated marksman, Anton. Anton studied the bullet, the entry wound, the angle, pulled out a range card and did quick calculations. Minimum 1,800 meters, possibly more. "In this weather? I'm telling you what the ballistics say." Volkov moved to the window and looked south through the storm. The buildings 2nd Platoon occupied were barely visible through the snow. Dark shapes against white background, making an aimed shot from that distance in these conditions was impossible, he said aloud. "Commander Petrov is dead," Anton replied. "So apparently not impossible." Volkov's radio crackled. Other positions checking in, reporting the situation, asking for instructions. He realized everyone was waiting for him to make decisions that Petrov should have been making. "All positions, status report," he said into the radio. The reports came back, scattered and uncertain. Nobody had visual confirmation of the shooter. Nobody had taken effective fire except from the suppressive bursts that had erupted right after Petrov went down. The Americans were moving, repositioning, but without coordination from the command post, the observers couldn't vector fires effectively. The siege was collapsing. "We need to reorganize," Dmitry said, stating the obvious. Obviously, Volkov tried to think tactically, but his mind kept returning to the shot. 2,000 meters in a blizzard, standing target, moving, giving orders, single shot, instant kill. That wasn't luck. That was capability that exceeded anything he'd encountered in 3 years of urban warfare. Who were they fighting? He'd assumed 2nd Platoon was a standard Marine unit, good training, decent equipment, but nothing exceptional. Now he wasn't sure. Standard Marines didn't have snipers who made impossible shots. Standard Marines didn't have shooters who could decapitate command structures from beyond visual range. "Pull everyone back to defensive positions," Volkov ordered. "Consolidate on floors 9 and 10. No one exposes themselves to southern windows." "That concedes the Overwatch advantage," Anton protested. "The Overwatch advantage got Petrov killed. We maintain firing positions, but we don't expose ourselves to counter sniper fire. Clear?" Grudging acknowledgement from the other fighters. They understood the logic even if they didn't like admitting fear. Volkov looked at Petrov's body one more time, tried to imagine the shot, the distance, the wind, the math required to make everything align. Whoever had made that shot wasn't just skilled. They were operating at a level that suggested professional training far beyond military standards. The kind of capability that belonged to intelligence services or special operations units that didn't officially exist. And that person was still out there. Somewhere in the storm. Probably repositioned already. Watching. Waiting. Looking for another target. The thought made Volkov's skin crawl. "Cover Petrov's body," he said quietly. "And someone tell command we need reinforcements." But even as he said it, he knew reinforcements wouldn't matter if the person behind that rifle decided to keep shooting. Meanwhile, in the southern buildings, 2nd Platoon was experiencing their own version of shock. Staff Sergeant Brennan watched through his rifle scope as enemy fighters pulled back from the windows they'd been dominating for 3 days. Pulled back not because they'd been forced to retreat, but because they were afraid to stay exposed. "They're actually scared," Corporal Hutton said, sounding amazed. "Look at them. They're hiding." Lance Corporal Torres was repositioning to a building with better sightlines, moving freely through spaces that had been death traps an hour ago. Whatever she did, it worked. "They've completely lost initiative." "She killed their commander," Sergeant Kimball said, lowering her binoculars. "One shot. From, I don't even know how far. 2,000 yards? More?" "Through a blizzard," Private Marsh added. He wasn't laughing now. Wasn't making jokes about wrong rifles or sweetheart snipers, just staring north with a expression that mixed respect and disbelief. "She made a shot I wouldn't attempt in perfect conditions." Brennan tried to process what he'd witnessed. He'd seen the muzzle flash from her position, heard the report, then, seconds later, watched through his scope as someone in the northern high-rise simply dropped. No warning, no suppressing fire, just sudden, violent death delivered from impossible range in impossible conditions. "Where is she now?" he asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew. She'd fired her shot, taken the inevitable return fire, and disappeared. Exactly like she'd said she would. No communication, no request for extraction. Just professional execution of an insane plan followed by immediate relocation. "Should we send someone to check her position?" Torres asked. "She said not to," Brennan replied. "And I'm not in the habit of second-guessing people who just saved my entire platoon." The radio crackled with traffic from the repositioning Marines. Everyone reporting successful movement to better positions. The tactical situation had completely reversed in the span of 5 minutes. "We should try to contact her," Kimball suggested. "At least confirm she's alive." Brennan reached for his radio, then hesitated. "How? We don't even know her call sign, don't know her frequency, don't know anything except she makes impossible shots and doesn't follow standard protocol. So what do? We take advantage of what she gave us, consolidate our position, prepare for the enemy to eventually reorganize, and if she wants to make contact, she will." It was pragmatic reasoning, but it felt wrong. Someone had just performed a miracle on their behalf, and they couldn't even properly thank her. Private Marsh was still staring north. "Who is she? I mean, really? That's not normal Marine training. That's something else entirely." "Something classified, probably," Hutton said. "The kind of thing they don't tell us about because we're not cleared to know." "I don't care about classifications," Torres said. "I care that she just kept us all from dying. That's enough." Brennan agreed. Questions about her background could wait for debriefings that might never happen. What mattered now was using the tactical opportunity she'd created. "All positions, this is Brennan," he said into the radio. "Establish defensive perimeter around the new positions. Ammunition check. Casualty report. Let's make sure her shot wasn't wasted." The platoon responded with crisp efficiency, relieved to be doing something productive instead of slowly dying in an untenable position. As they worked, snow continued to fall. The storm showed no signs of abating. But somehow, the cold didn't seem as threatening anymore. The city didn't seem as hostile. One shot had changed everything. One person, standing alone in a window, refusing to accept that impossible meant impossible. Somewhere in the ruins, she was moving through shadows, already forgotten by everyone except the Marines whose lives she'd saved, and the enemy fighters who now understood they'd been wrong about who they were fighting. The platoon would remember this day, remember the moment when someone they'd dismissed proved more capable than anyone they'd ever served with. Remember the lesson: never underestimate the person standing quiet in the corner with the wrong rifle. Because sometimes the wrong rifle, in the right hands, is exactly what salvation looks like. The rifle had a name, not an official designation or a military nomenclature, just a name she'd given it years ago, during the build process, when it was still parts scattered across a workbench in a safe house that no longer existed. She called it Variable, because that's what it was designed to solve: variable conditions, variable distances, variable circumstances that made standard platforms inadequate. The receiver was from a civilian hunting rifle. Remington 700, well-worn, bought at a gun show in Montana using cash and a fake ID. The action had been blueprinted, disassembled, and machined to tolerances tighter than factory specifications. Every surface trued, every engagement point precisely fitted. The barrel was custom. 26 inches, heavy contour, chambered in, 300 Winchester Magnum, built by a gunsmith in Arizona who asked no questions and kept no records. The rifling was hand-lapped, each groove polished until the barrel's interior was smoother than most commercial firearms achieved. The stock was adjustable. Length of pull could change. Cheek height could modify. Designed to fit her specifically, but adaptable if her shooting position required different body mechanics. The scope was German, a boutique manufacturer that produced maybe 50 units per year, all custom ordered, all absurdly expensive. Variable magnification, from 5x to 25x, glass so clear it looked like you were seeing through empty air. Adjustments graduated in 1 mil increments, allowing microscopic changes to point of aim. The trigger was aftermarket, single stage, braking at exactly 2 pounds of pressure, no creep, no over travel, just the clean release that made the difference between hitting and missing at extreme distances. Total cost to build, approximately $18,000. Total rounds fired through it, 1,848 as of 4 minutes ago. It was the wrong gun by military standards, because military standards assumed standardization, assumed that equipment should be interchangeable, that if a rifle broke, you grabbed another rifle from supply and continued the mission. This rifle couldn't be replaced. If something broke, she fixed it herself, using tools and parts she carried. If the scope failed, she had backup iron sights calibrated to her specific ammunition. If the barrel wore out, which it would, eventually she'd replace it with another custom barrel made to the same specifications. Military procurement officials would have hated it. Logistics officers would have refused to support it. Armorers would have complained about the lack of standardized parts. But none of them had to make shots at 2,000 yards in blizzard conditions while standing exposed to return fire. She did, and this rifle let her do it consistently. The ammunition was equally non-standard. Each round represented about $40 in components and labor. Custom brass cases, sorted by weight to ensure consistency. Premium bullets, match grade, tested for concentricity. Powder charges measured to the 1/10 of a grain. Primers seated to exact depths. She loaded every round herself, checked every dimension, recorded every variable in notebooks that documented thousands of rounds across hundreds of different environmental conditions. The result was ammunition that performed identically, shot after shot. Where factory ammunition might vary by 50 feet per second in velocity, hers varied by less than 10. Where factory bullets might group in 2-inch circles at 100 yards, hers grouped in half-inch circles. Precision compounding across distance. At 100 yards, the difference was minor. At 2,000 yards, the difference was everything. In the ruins of what used to be a hotel, 3 buildings west of her shooting position, she sat in darkness performing post-shot maintenance. The ritual was automatic, muscle memory refined through years of repetition. Bolt disassembled, components checked for stress or wear, action wiped clean of powder residue. Light oil applied to bearing surfaces. Barrel inspected with a bore scope, looking for copper fouling or throat erosion. Clean, as expected. She never let copper build up enough to affect accuracy. Scope checked for zero retention. The shot's recoil should have been absorbed by the rifle's design, but she verified anyway. Consistency wasn't about assumption. It was about confirmation. Everything functioned perfectly, as it always did. She reassembled the rifle in complete darkness, hands finding each component by feel, no light needed. She could assemble this weapon blindfolded in a sandstorm, had done exactly that during training in North Africa years ago. When the rifle was whole again, she sat back against a wall and allowed herself 30 seconds of rest. The shot had been clean, execution flawless, outcome exactly as calculated, but the margin had been thin. Wind had been at the upper end of her acceptable variance. Temperature had affected powder burns slightly more than anticipated. The bullet had drifted 3 inches farther than her calculations predicted. 3 inches at 2,100 yards. Still within the target's vital zone. Still a kill, but 3 inches of error meant her model needed refinement. She pulled out her notebook and recorded the details while they were fresh. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, observed bullet impact versus calculated impact. Everything documented for future reference. This was how you got better. Not through pride and success, but through analysis of variance. Understanding why the bullet went where it went, then adjusting the model to make the next shot more accurate. 11 years of this process. 11 years of recording, analyzing, refining, building a database of ballistic knowledge that existed nowhere except in her notebooks and her muscle memory. No instructor had taught her this methodology. She developed it herself through trial and error and obsessive attention to detail. Through refusing to accept that good enough was sufficient. The Marines would never understand this rifle because they'd never needed to. Their mission parameters worked with standard equipment and standard doctrine. They fought battles where fire superiority and tactical coordination mattered more than individual marksmanship. She fought battles that came down to single moments, single shots, single chances to change outcomes through precision alone. Different missions, different tools, different philosophies of warfare. Private Marsh had called it the wrong gun. He'd been correct, in a sense. It was wrong for what he did, perfect for what she did. She finished her notes and packed the notebook away. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, the temperature was dropping as night approached. Time to move again. Staying in one place too long created patterns. Patterns created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities got you killed. She stood, shouldered the rifle, and prepared to disappear back into the city's ruins. Behind her, 3 buildings away, Marines were still talking about the impossible shot, still trying to understand how someone had made mathematics work when physics should have prevented it. They'd never get a full explanation, never know about the years of preparation that made those 2 seconds look effortless, never understand that the shot hadn't been impossible, just improbable, requiring preparation they couldn't imagine. That was fine. Understanding wasn't necessary, only results mattered. She moved through the darkness, leaving the Marines to their speculation, leaving the enemy to their fear, leaving the evidence of her presence to fade like tracks in snow. Somewhere ahead, there would be another mission, another impossible task, another moment where people needed someone willing to stand in a window and make the shot nobody else could make. She'd be ready. The rifle would be ready. Variable conditions, variable solutions, always. The helicopter arrived at 0230 hours, rotors beating against the storm, floodlights cutting through snow, medical evacuation for the wounded, resupply for the survivors, extraction from a position that was no longer tenable now that the enemy knew exactly where 2nd Platoon had been operating. Staff Sergeant Brennan supervised the loading of casualties, checking names against his roster. Everyone accounted for. 16 Marines had entered this battle. 16 were leaving, though 3 were on stretchers and 2 needed help walking. "Where's the sniper?" the helicopter crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. Brennan looked around, scanned the Marines, assembling for extraction. Didn't see her. "Corporal Hutton," he called, "where's our sniper specialist?" Hutton checked the surrounding area. "Haven't seen her since the engagement, Sergeant." Sergeant Kimball emerged from one of the buildings, also looking. "Not in any of the structures. I checked." Brennan keyed his radio. "Anyone have eyes on the specialist who made the long-range shot?" Negative responses from all positions. He tried different approach. "Specialist, this is Staff Sergeant Brennan. Helicopter is on site for extraction. Acknowledge." Static. Then more static. "She's not answering," Torres said, arriving from a perimeter position. "Want me to do a building-by-building search?" Brennan considered it. The helicopter couldn't wait indefinitely. Fuel was limited. Weather was worsening. Every minute on the ground increased risk. "Did anyone actually see her after the shot?" he asked. Nobody had. She'd fired, disappeared, and hadn't been seen since, exactly like she'd said she would do. "Maybe she extracted separately," Private Marsh suggested. "Special operations types do that sometimes, right? They complete their mission and exfiltrate through different channels." "Without telling us?" Kimball said. "That's poor tactical coordination." "Everything about her was poor tactical coordination by normal standards," Brennan countered. "Why would extraction be different?" The crew chief was making hurry-up gestures. "Time to go." Brennan made a decision. Everyone on the bird. If she had alternate extraction planned, she's already gone. If she's still here and wants to leave with us, she knows where we are. The platoon loaded up. Wounded first, then equipment, then the remaining Marines. Brennan went last, taking a final look around the intersection they'd held for 3 days. No sign of her, no movement, just snow and ruins, and the ghosts of a battle that was already fading into history. He climbed aboard. The helicopter lifted, rotors screaming, rising into the storm. Through the window, he watched the city fall away into white darkness. Somewhere down there, maybe, a person with a custom rifle and no name, or maybe she'd already left hours ago, moved on to whatever mission came next. "You think she's okay?" Hutton asked over the intercom. Brennan thought about the shot, about the precision, about the calculating calm that suggested complete mastery of an impossible skill set. "Yeah," he said, "she's fine. People like that don't die easy. The helicopter turned south, leaving the frozen city behind. 3 days later, at a forward operating base 200 kilometers away, an intelligence officer was compiling after-action reports when she noticed an anomaly. 2nd Platoon's roster showed 16 Marines. The casualty reports showed 16 Marines, but the combat narrative mentioned 17 personnel engaged, including a sniper specialist who'd made a tactical shot that changed the engagement's outcome. She checked the attached personnel list. No sniper specialist, no additional names. Nothing in the official record indicated anyone beyond the standard platoon complement had been present. She called Staff Sergeant Brennan for clarification. "Sir, your report mentions a sniper making a 2,000-yard shot during the engagement at grid reference Hotel 7. Can you provide that individual's name and service number for the record?" Brennan was silent for a moment. "I don't have that information, ma'am." "You don't have their name?" "No, ma'am." "How is that possible if they were attached to your unit?" She arrived with authorization codes that checked out. Communications were degraded. "We didn't verify everything we should have." The intelligence officer made notes. "What can you tell me about this individual?" "Female, early 30s, blonde hair, gray eyes. Carried a custom rifle, non-standard configuration. Operated independently. Made the shot that eliminated enemy command and control. And then she disappeared. Wasn't on the extraction helicopter. No communication since the engagement." More notes. "This was unusual. Highly unusual. I'll need to follow up on this," the intelligence officer said. "If there was an unauthorized individual operating in your area..." "Ma'am, authorization codes checked out. Whatever she wasn't unauthorized." "Then, where did she come from?" "Above my pay grade, ma'am. Way above." The intelligence officer ended the call and stared at her notes. Female sniper, no name, no service record. Authorization codes that verified but led nowhere. Made an impossible shot and vanished. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize patterns. This had all the hallmarks of a black operations specialist. Someone who existed in the gaps between official military structure and classified programs nobody talked about. She could pursue this, file reports, ask questions, demand answers, or she could recognize when a mystery wasn't meant to be solved. The sniper had saved 16 Marines. That was documented. The rest, who she was, where she came from, where she went, that was probably classified at levels that would get the intelligence officer's security clearance revoked just for asking. She made her decision, updated the after-action report to reflect additional supporting elements, details classified, filed it, moved on to the next item requiring attention. Somewhere in a records database, a footnote existed about a sniper who didn't exist making a shot that shouldn't have been possible. That was all the acknowledgement she'd ever receive. 6 months later, in a bar near Camp Lejeune, 3 Marines from 2nd Platoon were drinking and telling stories. "I'm telling you, it happened," Corporal Hutton said, working on his 3rd beer. 2,000 yards in a blizzard, standing shot, 1 round, 1 kill. The Marine from a different unit shook his head. "No way, nobody makes that shot in those conditions." "I was there. I saw the muzzle flash, saw the target drop." "You saw someone drop. Doesn't mean it was from a 2,000-yard shot. Probably coincidence. Maybe he had a heart attack." Lance Corporal Torres leaned forward. "The enemy found the bullet. Man, we heard it through intelligence channels. Custom ammunition, extreme long-range ballistics. The math checked out. So there was a sniper somewhere. Doesn't prove it was this mysterious woman you keep talking about." Private Marsh signaled for another round. "I saw her, talked to her, told her she had the wrong rifle. And I was an idiot. That rifle was built specifically for shots like that. Custom everything. She knew exactly what she was doing." The skeptical Marine still wasn't convinced. "Okay, let's say it happened. Who was she? What unit?" All 3 Marines from 2nd Platoon went quiet. "No idea," Hutton finally said. "How do you not know? She was attached to your platoon. She showed up with codes that checked out. Did her job. Disappeared. Never got a name. That's the most Black Ops bullshit I've ever heard." "Probably was Black Ops," Torres said. "Or something like it. Whatever agency trains people to make impossible shots and then vanish like ghosts." The skeptical Marine laughed. You guys are full of it. This is urban legend material. Next you'll tell me she was invisible and could fly. Believe what you want, Marsh said. But 16 of us lived through that engagement because of her. That's not a legend, that's documented fact. The conversation moved on to other topics, other deployments, other stories from the war that never seemed to end. But later that night, when the skeptical Marine was alone, he looked up the engagement at Grid Reference Hotel 7, found the after-action report. Read about 2nd Platoon's tactical situation. Saw the notation about additional supporting elements, details classified. Maybe not bullshit after all. Maybe just one of those things the military did but never talked about. Specialists who existed outside normal chains of command. People who solved problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. He'd heard rumors before. Everyone had. Stories about shooters who could make impossible shots. Teams that didn't officially exist. Operations that never appeared in any public record. Usually he dismissed those stories as exaggeration. Warriors embellishing their experiences. The natural inflation that happened when people told combat stories over beers. But this one felt different. Too specific. Too consistent across multiple witnesses. Too well documented in official records, even if those records didn't explain everything. He saved the after-action report to his personal files. Didn't know why. Just felt like something worth remembering. The story spread. Not widely, not into civilian consciousness, but among certain military communities, the legend grew. The woman who made the impossible shot in the blizzard. The sniper with no name. The specialist who appeared when situations were desperate and disappeared when the crisis passed. Details varied depending on who told the story. Some versions had her making multiple shots. Others had her single-handedly defeating an entire enemy company. The distance grew with each retelling. 2,000 yards became 2,000, 500, then 3,000, then numbers that were physically impossible. But the core remained consistent. Somewhere, in some conflict, a woman with a custom rifle had stood in a window during a storm and changed the outcome of a battle through pure precision. Veterans who'd been at Hotel 7 neither confirmed nor denied the embellishments. They just smiled and said you had to be there to understand. In an office in Virginia that had no name on any directory, a man reviewed operational reports from the past 6 months. His job was quality control for programs that officially didn't exist, making sure assets were deployed effectively, ensuring capabilities were maintained without compromising operational security. He came to a report filed by an operative identified only by a numerical code. Grid Reference Hotel 7. Mission parameters. Stabilize 2nd Platoon. Eliminate enemy command structure. Outcome. Successful. No names. No details beyond tactical necessities. Just confirmation that the objective had been achieved within acceptable parameters. He marked the file as reviewed and moved to the next item. But he paused, allowing himself a rare moment of reflection. The operative in question had been with the program for 11 years. 43 confirmed missions. 43 successful outcomes. 0 compromised operations. 0 blown covers. The best specialist he'd ever managed. Maybe the best anyone had ever managed. He typed a brief note into the encrypted system. Recommend continued deployment per existing protocols. Asset remains optimal for extreme requirement scenarios. Then he closed the file and forgot about it. That's how these programs worked. Each mission isolated, each operative compartmentalized. Success measured not in recognition, but in outcomes nobody would ever attribute to the right cause. Somewhere, that operative was probably preparing for the next mission. Cleaning that custom rifle, loading custom ammunition, running calculations for scenarios that didn't exist yet, but would, eventually. Ready to stand in the next window. Make the next impossible shot. Prove again that impossible was just another variable to solve. The man smiled briefly, then returned to his work. In a city that wasn't the frozen one but looked similar, buildings destroyed, streets empty, war grinding through another nameless urban center, a woman sat on the roof of a collapsed apartment building. She wore different camouflage now, desert tan instead of snow white. The environment had changed, but the mathematics remained constant. Before her, the rifle. Cleaned, oiled, ready. The notebook opened beside her, showing calculations for wind drift at 1,000, 800 yards, in 35-degree heat, with cross breeze from the east. The target visible through her scope. Another commander. Another tactical opportunity. Another moment where precision would determine outcomes. She breathed slowly, heart rate steady, no tremor in her hands. Somewhere behind her, a platoon was pinned down. Different Marines, different country, same tactical desperation. They didn't know she was here, didn't know help existed beyond visual range. They would know soon. She settled into position, made final adjustments, calculated for all the variables that could be calculated and accepted the ones that couldn't. The shot was difficult, not impossible. There was a difference. She'd learned that difference 11 years ago, taught by failure and refined through repetition. Learned that impossible was just probability approaching zero, and probability never reached zero for someone willing to control enough variables. Her finger found the trigger. The target moved into optimal position. Wind held steady for 3 seconds. She fired. The rifle spoke. The bullet flew. The mathematics resolved into physics. Impact, effect, outcome. 2 seconds later, the target was down. 4 seconds after that, she was moving, relocating, disappearing into the rubble before return fire arrived at where she'd been. Behind her, the Marines would begin advancing, using the window she'd created, surviving because of a shot they didn't know had been made by a person they'd never meet. The pattern repeated, city after city, battle after battle, shot after shot. Always the same, always different. She moved through shadows, carrying the wrong rifle, solving impossible problems, leaving nothing behind except results that would be attributed to luck or divine intervention or tactical genius that belonged to someone else. That was acceptable. Recognition wasn't the mission. Success was the mission. And she never missed. Not when it mattered. The city faded behind her as she moved toward extraction coordinates that existed only in her encrypted communications. Another mission complete. Another legend beginning in the minds of people who would never know the truth. Another silence between shots, waiting for the next time someone needed impossible to become real. She walked through the ruins, alone, unburdened by doubt or hesitation, the rifle on her back, the calculations in her mind. The mathematics of violence solved one variable at a time. Always ready, always precise, always gone before anyone could ask the questions that didn't have answers. The wrong gun in the right hands. The woman with no name doing the work no one else could do. Disappearing into white noise and sand and smoke. Waiting for the next window, the next storm. The next moment when standing meant survival and sitting meant death. Ready.